Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about an anniversary of something that happened 20 years ago exactly and totally changed my life. It changed the way I see everything, the way I think about everything, and the path of my life since, in every way. It was changed by what happened exactly 20 years ago. As some of you may know, I have been making I was going to say a documentary, but we were doing pre-production to a documentary about Afghanistan. And we were in Pakistan, we being my great friends, David and Leon Flamhoek, two veteran filmmakers. And we were heading towards Afghanistan. And just after the London bombs of 7/7/2005, we were arrested in Peshawar, Pakistan, northwest frontier, and we ended up spending 16 days and 16 terrible nights in a torture cell, in a torture unit, in solitary confinement. As I say, it was an experience that changed my life, but I'm such a believer that nothing happens for no reason at all. And I'm such a believer in that we can learn lessons from everything. And gosh, I have never stopped learning lessons from that time, from that experience, the kind of which that most people watching this, for example, would never have the chance to experience. We had set off from New Delhi in India on a special secure bus that ran for a few months when relations were good, pretty good, between India and Pakistan. It was a 12-hour bus journey, and it ran from New Delhi in India to Lahore in Pakistan. And it had outriders of motorcyclists and jeeps. And we crossed the border at Wagah. It's very famous because anyone who knows it, the Pakistani and the Indian soldiers stride up to the actual border gate, doing a kind of goose step. And they're wearing these turbans with plumage, and it's quite remarkable. After the long day of driving in this secure bus, we reached Lahore. It was my first time there. It's a wonderful, wonderful town. And it was great to be back in Pakistan after a few years. And we were super excited about the journey ahead, about descending down through the Hindu Kush to Kabul. And I hadn't been to Afghanistan at that point. I was so excited. And we went to eat on Food Street in Lahore. And that night, David, Leon and I, we were beside ourselves with excitement for the journey that was about to unfold. Of course, we had no idea that the journey wasn't about to unfold, but an experience was unlike any other in my life. And thankfully, unlike any other in the lives that most people I know have lived. Next morning, we took a bus westwards to Peshawar, which is an ancient kind of post, I suppose, on the Grand Trunk Road. It was the great, bastion of, as they used to say, mercenaries, missionaries, and misfits during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, and even since the time of Kipling and the British Raj. Peshawar and the Grand Trunk Road that led to it had all kinds of stories to tell and historical importance. When we arrived in Peshawar, and it was a town that I knew pretty well because I had been there a lot in the 80s during the Soviet occupation, we stayed for a night in a really dilapidated, famous hotel called Green's Hotel with the La La Grill, which used to be during the Soviet times bombed or blown up all the time. But it was where all the spies and CIA and all kinds of secret services and aid workers hung out. And I knew it, and I was very nostalgic to be back there. The next morning, before leaving Peshawar to drive down to Kabul, down the Hindu Kush, David and Leon and I thought it would be a great idea if we went in search for a rather distant relative of mine for his house. I knew that he was dead. He was called Major Hassan Shah, and he had lived at an address, number 3A Baba Lane, in the cantonment. And the cantonment in some cities, this is this kind of military residential area. In some cities, like Peshawar, these cantonments, you know, they stretch back to the time of the British Raj. And the cantonment in Peshawar is just lovely. It's got beautiful streets and lovely villas, and it's shaded by trees. And there's birdsong and just wonder. And I wanted to find the house that I had spent so much time in the early and the mid-80s. And we couldn't find it for some reason. It was before Google Maps, of course, 20 years ago. And I was just doing a quick piece to camera, walking towards the camera with Leon filming and David standing behind the camera. And suddenly there was a motion from behind me. Obviously I couldn't see. And it was a military officer stepped out of a military checkpoint, and he was asking for us to stop filming, which of course we did. And that was caught on camera. And then the next thing we knew, we were being questioned, and we were told to wait at this little military guard post, and we did. And we waited and waited, and the hours passed, and our documents were checked and rechecked, and we were told to wait some more. And the atmosphere was good, and tea was brought, and more waiting. And then, after a very long time, another officer came. And bear in mind, it was actually exactly a week after the London bombs, which killed 52 innocent civilians at tube stations and on a bus in central London. So everyone was jittery. We had come from India, heading to Afghanistan to make a film about Afghanistan that was commissioned by Channel 5. I was married to an Indian and from a family that is Afghan, has Afghan ancestry. And my film crew, David and Leon Flamholt, were Swedish, but then Leon had been born in Kyrgyzstan. We were a complete mixture, a bit of a mess of a mixture. And to cut a long story short, we were taken at the end of the afternoon for a medical examination. We were put in the back of a pickup truck, and we were taken to a medical facility and blindfolded, and we were restrained as well. And Leon, who was a little older than David and I, was given an electrocardiogram. We realized later it was to check whether he could withstand electric shock treatment if tortured, but in that way. Then we were taken blindfolded and chained to a military facility, the first of 2 or 3, and we were all put in a collective cell, one cell. And you can see we had no idea what it was like to be incarcerated. they gave us some water to drink, and one of us said to the other, "Do you think it's mineral water?" We had no idea. And later, on that first night, they asked us, "Do you want something to drink?" And we said, "Yeah, some coffee, please." And they brought tea. And I remember, I think it was David said, "Hey, we asked for coffee." And they just looked at us and rolled their eyes. And then, little by little, and by twists and turns, the full extravaganza of the ordeal began. We were, I suppose, traded for another organization within the Pakistani Secret Service. It was Leon, who was a veteran of being in the Soviet war with Afghanistan and from all kinds of adventures. He whispered to us, "I think we've been traded to someone else." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because the spec of the blindfolds and the handcuffs are different." And he was totally right. Anyone who's ever worn a military-grade blindfold will know what I'm talking about when I say these aren't the kind of thing that you put on at a kid's party to play blind man's buff. When you're wearing an incredibly thick military-grade blindfold, you can hardly breathe. It strips every iota of light out. And with your hands manacled behind your back and your ankles manacled too, you feel that you're going to pass out and you're freaking terrified. And that's the thing. Until that point, I had never known real terror. I've been frightened as a child on some of my adventures in East Africa, in the Peruvian Amazon, and elsewhere. But I had never been so indescribably frightened that I thought I was going to be killed. We were taken to a new unit, which I later learned was called the Farm. And the three of us were put in separate solitary confinement cells. I won't go into all the details here, but there is something so obviously humbling and obviously just terrifying to be locked in a cell. You see the world through bars, and as you acclimatize, you hear the sounds of other inmates screaming because they've been tortured. And you realize you can't pick up a phone and call someone. You realize you can't even speak to your friends, your colleagues, David and Leon in my case, because we were in different cells. You just have to realize, regard this as a new normal, and wait. For the next 16 days and nights, we were held at the farm in solitary confinement. And every night, round about 10 or 11, I would hear the jailer's keys, and I would hear his shuffling footsteps, and he would come and take me. Sometimes I was blindfolded, and sometimes I was manacled, and sometimes I was not. And definitely in the earlier days of interrogations, I was always blindfolded. But later, I wasn't, and I saw the full horror of the torture room. It was like something out of James Bond. But there were clear differences. In James Bond, the equipment is always pretty new and nice, not always. In this one, it had been used a lot. There were harnesses to string people up, syringes with murky liquids inside, batons, knives, bludgeons, a wooden chair to tie people to. And all kinds of other devices, all very low grade. And yes, and I now remember there were electrical wires as well for electrocution. There was a detail that I remember noticing, and it was this, that there was a central drain, and there was a lot of hair and, grime in that central drain, and the whole room could just be reset by being hosed down. The interrogators were obsessed with me, less obsessed with David and Leon, because they rarely were taken for interrogations. But it was me they were obsessed with, because obviously I was from that part of the world, and I had an Afghan name, have an Afghan name. And as the days went on, I found myself just dealing with it. During the day, I would just lie on the cement floor of my cell, trying to amuse myself. And I did that in a way that I described in my book, In Arabian Nights. I told myself that I would project onto the white wall all the stories that I knew in a kind of cinema scope in my mind. I told myself the stories of Nasruddin and Mushkil Gashar and Hatim Tai and the king, the dog, and the golden bowl. And sometimes I cried, and sometimes I planned. But all the time, I strived to stay focused and not give in to the terrible, terrible uncertainty and the fear. Hindsight is an amazing, amazing thing. We look back at things that happen in our lives, and it's all good. But when you're in a situation where you don't know how it ends, you don't know, particularly in the beginning, it would have been easy for them to shoot us in the head and bury us in the back. You don't know how that is going to end. And how it did end was that I managed to smuggle word out to my older sister, Syra, that we were being held. And believe me, my friends, it is definitely not an easy thing to smuggle word out of a Pakistani torture prison that you are being held, incarcerated. There were no cell phones, communications, no access to our luggage, personal belongings. I was in boxer shorts all the time. And I did that by taking advantage of one of the trainees who he served the food on the weekend. And on the second weekend, I got him to call a number. And he did. And he said on an answering machine, Tahir Shah and his friends are alive. And this message, cryptic and bizarre as it was, got to my older sister Syra, who had made the film Beneath the Veil in the early 2000s, just days before 9/11. And she jumped on a plane and came to Pakistan and realized what had happened and started to help to effect our release. There's much more to it than all of that. But the way I see it, and considering it now, 2 decades have passed. Pakistan is still in the news. The war on terror, as the Americans called it at first, is still going on. Since then, I was 48. Since then, now I'm 58. Oh, I was 38. Since then, I'm 58. I've written a lot more books. we eventually went to Afghanistan a few months later after being deported from Pakistan and met by MI5 at Heathrow Airport. And we went back and we made a film called Afghan Gold about my search for the great lost treasure of Ahmed Shah Durrani in Afghanistan, supposedly valued at $520 billion. This experience, as I've said, is one that has shaped me since. And I think of it all the time. Most of all, I think how lucky I am to be free and to be healthy and to have food and not to have my hands and ankles chained and a military-grade blindfold over my face. But most of all, each evening for a few seconds, I think back to that time and I think about the person who right now, at this very moment, is almost certainly in the cell which I myself was put in. And I wonder what's going through their mind and the fear that they are experiencing. And each night, for a few seconds, I just say a little prayer for that person, whoever they are, that they get out like we did.